Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at a match that is being played in Utrecht, Netherlands between Hans Nieman from the United States and Anish Giri from the Netherlands. Now, before we jump right into the video, I do want to point one thing out, which is we did a recap of the SEC match between Hans and Wesley yesterday. While I was recording this recap, there was apparently a very wild interview between Hans and Daniel Naroditsky, which I've not had time to check out yet. But if you guys would like for me to react to it, please let me know. All right, so station break over, back to the match itself. So this match, which is being played, has a blended format. So the players played 12 games of Blitz yesterday, where Hans defeated Anish by a score of 7.5 to 4.5, but now they move on to the classical portion. Now, as I was stating during my live stream on Kick yesterday, I felt that Hans has a big advantage in Blitz, but in Rapid and Classical, Anish's class and general understanding should show a little bit more. So the players are playing a classical game today. This does count towards the world rankings. Anish Giri currently ranked about number 14 in the world. If he wins this game, he will move back up to being right on the edge of the top 10. Well, for Hans, he's at 27-11, somewhere around number 26, 27 in the world. If he wins, he makes a big step up towards the top 20. All right, let's jump right into the action. So the players are playing a classical game, 90 minutes with a 30-second increment, no secondary time control. So if the players get really low on time, that should favor Hans. So the game starts with the move e4. We get Anish playing the Sicilian. Now we have knight f3, d6, and this move bishop b5. Now throughout the Blitz games, Hans was playing this bishop b5 check variation, and he actually won a couple of games, got a lot of really good positions. So why not repeat the same thing in classical? We get knight to d7 being played. Here we have the move d4. Now we get pawn takes pawn, and the move knight takes pawn. Now I believe that yesterday Hans was playing this move a4, and I think it was something like a4, I think it was a4, knight f6, d3, something like e6, a5, a6, bishop c4, and Hans got a lot of very good positions in those games. I think actually Anish might have also played g6 as well. Don't have those games memorized by heart, but we did get a lot of games which feature this bishop b5 move. Hans today plays d4 because after playing all these lines with a4, he figures that Anish will be super well prepared and he wants to change it up. So we get takes, knight f6, bishop to d3. And now we have the move knight c5 being played, where these knights hit the pawn and the bishop at the same time. Hans goes knight c3, we get the move a6, and now we have the move knight b3, and here Anish trades the knight for the bishop. And at this point, black has the two b's in return for white having a bishop and a knight. But more importantly for white has ideas like bishop e3, knight e5, maybe f4, e5. So if black can finish his development before white gets a big attack in the center of the board, black should be a little bit better. We get the move g6. a4 played by Hans to stop the move b5. We get the move bishop g7, bishop e3, and now we have bishop e6. Knight d4 is played, and we get the move knight g4 from Anish. Thus far, it seems that players are relatively comfortable with the position. I would say the computer already starting to like black's position a little bit more, which is surprising considering how early in the game we are. So we get the trade on e6. Bishop d4 is played, Anish castles, Hans castles, we get the trade of the bishops, and now we have the move queen a5. Now, while black has these double pawns on e7 and e6, this pawn on e6 plays a huge role here as it stops white from being able to play knight d5. If white could go knight d5 here, hitting the pawn on e7, maybe b4, c4, knight b6, this knight would be incredibly well placed, but this pawn on e6 stops all those ideas. Here Hans plays the move h3, we get queen to e5, offering the trade of the queens, and Hans has to trade the queens. If Hans were to move the queen away, there's simply queen h2 checkmate, and the white king is stuck. So we get the trade, and now it's very clear that out of the opening phase of the game, Anish Giri has outplayed Hans Nieman, whether it was a preparation failure where Hans maybe miscalculated something or he misremembered a line. Something has gone wrong here, and Anish is better because the pawn on e6 stops knight d5, and black has ideas like putting the rook on the c file as well as knight to c4. That being said, it is not the end of the world for white. So you get the move knight to e2 being played. Anish goes rook c8, we got c3, and now we have the move knight to c4, pressuring the pawn on b2. Additionally, if white plays a move like rook b1 to guard the pawn, there's knight d2 forking the rooks, and black wins the game. So after knight to c4, we get this move f3 being played by Hans, and now we have the move knight takes b2 from Anish, taking the pawn on b2. We get rook up b1, knight c4, and now we have rook takes b7. And here we have this move king to f7 being played by Anish to guard the pawn on e7. At this point, material's even here, but nonetheless, it still is very, very slightly better for black due to these weak pawns on c3 and a4. Now, it's very common in the game of chess actually to see these two pawns on the C and A files, whether it's white or black. Recently, when I played Magnus Carlsen in Titled Tuesday, it was the same situation where I had these two weaknesses. Magnus played a great endgame and beat me in the Titled Tuesday event. So this is probably the most common weakened pawn structure that you will see in the game of chess. We get the move rook A B1 from Hans. We have the move e5 from Anish. This is a very logical move as it stops knight from jumping to f4 d4. Additionally, with the pawn on c3, the knight can no longer get to this d5 square. And also down the road, you can even push this pawn to e6 just to illustrate it, where let's just put something like this. And again, both the squares are covered. So now the d4 and d5 squares are both covered, and the knight really is lacking in squares. So after e5, we get rook b4. Anish plays knight a5. We get rook b6. Now we have rook a8 guarding the pawn on a6. We have to move f4, rook c8 is played, and now we get the trade of pawns. Now at this point, Anish has doubled e-pawns on e5 and e7, but as you can tell from the valuation bar, black is substantially better here because the white knight is simply dominated. Doesn't have squares, knight c4 is coming in here, and now white also has three weaknesses. These three pawns are all weak here. So you get the move rook b1, knight c4 from Anish, rook b4, king e6, we get to move king h2, and now a5 is played to kick the rook away from b4. We get rook to b7, and now we have the move rook c6. Pawns here for Anish are perfectly placed as well because his pawn on a5 is anchored by the horse. So when you look at the pawns on a5 and e5, they're anchored by the horse, whereas white's knight is still very passive, and all three of these pawns are very weak. So we get the move knight g1. Anish plays knight to d6, forking the rook and the pawn while attacking the pawn on c3 at the same time. We get rook b6, and now we have another excellent move, which is rook a c8. If black were to take the pawn on c3 after knight to f3, there are ideas like knight g5 to fork the king of the pawn. If you play h6, there are moves like rook b5 now, and suddenly white has all kinds of counterplay in the center of the board. So we get rook a c8. Hans plays the move knight to f3. We get the move h6, stopping knight g5, but more importantly, this move rook b5 is not in play here, as this rook on c6 stops any of the ideas. We get knight to h4. Here we have g5, knight to f5 played by Hans. We get the move knight takes e4, knight takes h6, and now we have the move knight takes c3. At this point, black has one extra pawn. Sure, it's a doubled e pawn, but this is a pass pawn going up the board here, so Hans is in serious trouble. We get to move rook to b3, knight takes a4, rook to b5, and now we have the move rook c5 being played, and here Hans goes rook b7. He does not trade the rooks because after takes rook to a3 and a4, knight g4, black can start to bring the rook over, maybe even bring the king over, and this a pawn is simply too fast, while for white it's very hard to create a passed h pawn going up the board. So we get rook b7. Now we have the move knight to c3, rook a7. We get to move rook c7. Important move as well. If you play the move a4 here, white can go rook b7, stacking the towers and going after the pawn on e7. So we get rook c7. Hans, of course, plays rook a6, not trading the rooks. We get king d5, and now we have the move knight g4. As you will notice from the time situation, Hans is up a lot of time on the clock, nearly 35 minutes here, and this is one of the things that plays to his strength, which is he's very good at playing on less time. He's very good at making quicker moves. So at this point, with such a bad position, it makes a lot of sense to try and play on the clock as well as the board. We get the move king to d4. Hans plays rook b8. We get to move a4, rook to d8, and now we get this move rook d5. Another excellent move from Anish. This knight on c3 is great. It guards the rook and the pawn. It also, the rook shields the king, so now you can try to push the e pawn up the board and use the wide p-pose. Get the move rook a8. Now we have e4, and here we get the move rook takes a4. Hans sacks the rook for the knight and the pawn. Now you'll notice the computer gives us as a big mistake. It's very hard to be critical of Anish because rook to d6, which is the best move, allows rook a5, and I guess after e4, rook g5, e3, it's probably winning, but there are moves like knight e5, knight f3, and it just feels a little bit difficult to play because the knight stops the e pawn, and this a pawn can't easily go up the board. Nonetheless, this is the best line. So Anish plays e4, Hans sacks the rook with rook takes pawn, takes, and now we get to move king c5. Black cannot go king to d3. I guess you could go here, but after knight to f2 check, king e2, and knight takes e4, black is very marginally better here because even though you have a rook for a knight, this pawn on g5 is super weak, and white also has potential to create some pass pawns on the king side if you ever lose this pawn. So we get king c5, not rook c4, by the way. Because if you go rook c4, it's the same problem. I take, I check, fork the king of the rook. Here takes, and now I think after king to g1, king d4, king f2, king d3, king e1, king e3, and g3, white is able to create a passed h pawn here, and after h4, takes here, the game will simply end in a draw. So Anish goes king c5, we get takes, king d6. Now we have the move rook to e2, and here we have rook c8 being played by Anish. Hans goes knight f2, trying to put the knight on e4 and pressure the pawn on g5, and now we get the move rook e5. Here we have the move rook to a2. Now we get rook c6, stopping any checks on the 6th rank, and we get this move knight g4. Now we get rook to e1, rook to a5, and here the move rook c5 is played. We get rook a6, king d5, rook to g6, and now Anish goes forward with the king with king d4, intending to push the e pawn up the board. We get knight h6, rook f1, rook g7, and now Anish throws all caution to the wind and starts pushing this p up the board, trying to win the game. We get knight g4, e4 is played, and here we have the move rook d7, king c3, king g3, and now we get the move king b2, not king c2, because then there would be knight e3, which wins the game for white. So we get king b2. Now we have rook d2, king c3, repetition here, and we get the move king c1, rook a2, and now we have rook c3 check being played, king to h2, and we get the move rook to f4, and here rook a1, king d2, check, king d3, and now we get this move g3. Now it's worth pointing out here, white is losing the game after rook to a5 and e3, e2. White doesn't really have anything better than sacking the knight for the pawn, but with the two rooks and the king coming backwards, black is winning. But when Hans plays g3 here, this simply loses the game on the spot. We get rook takes knight, pawn takes, and now we get this move rook to c2 check being played. Now at the very beginning you're thinking, well, wait, this is just over. Takes, it's just winning. King g2, king f2, the pawn goes up the board, you get a queen, and it's immediate. However, it is not immediate, because after rook c2, white can play the very devilish move king to h3, sacking the rook, and if you take, as you'll notice, it's uh-oh spaghetti time. The king is stuck. This is stalemate. The game ends in a draw. But after king to h3, Anish can play e3, pushing this e pawn up the board, and the king is one square too far away from covering the pawn. We get rook a8, e2, check, king e3, check, king d2, check, king c1, rook e8, king d1, check, rook d2, and now rook to a8 is played here by Hans. And here Anish correctly plays the move rook to d3, and at this point Hans Nieman resigns the game. I will point out that if black were to make a queen, this would be an epic fail, because after check here and takes, if you take the rook, once again it's stalemate. The king has no squares available, and the game ends in a draw. But after rook d3 is played, there's no longer a rook on the 2nd rank, so the king has both these squares available, and the game would have concluded with check. Here, check, king e3, rook to a1, stopping the pawn, and now you can go king to f2, rook a2, and king to f1 here, and now the pawn is going up the board, and with the king always having this one square on h2 available, there are no ideas for stalemate. So after rook to d3, Hans resigns this game. Anish gets a very, very big win. He moves very close to the top 10 once again. He might be in the top 10 already with this victory, as he's back over 2750. But a fantastic game showing how good Anish's understanding was in that late middle game and end game to dominate that knight on e2, where no squares available. Just a masterpiece of a technical positional game from Anish. And this is also why I've stressed a few times that this is a big difference between playing classical chess and rapid and blitz. This game that Anish won here in classical would never have been possible maybe in rapid it would have been maybe possible, but definitely not possible in blitz. And so that is the big difference. Is sometimes when you play blitz, it's much more about intuition, general quick understanding and precision making moves, versus actual technical precision where you try to find the perfect move every time. And Anish really showcases why he is such a strong classical player with this great victory over Hans. So they are playing, I believe, 6 games, I think, of classical chess. They play 2 games today, 2 games tomorrow, 2 games the following day before they play some rapid chess. If Anish runs it up in this classical portion, he's very likely to win the match, but nonetheless it is only 1 game at the end of the day. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the first game from the classical portion of the Hans versus Anish match being played in Utrecht. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I'll be back with some more recaps probably later today. We'll do a recap of the very big SEC match between Magnus Carlsen and Arjun Erigaisi. But at any rate, that's going to be it for right now, so I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you very soon. Have a good one. Bye.